Good morning still here, and most welcome to 1335 of the Heidegger series. Sorry about the rather abrupt ending of the previous lecture, 1334. We ran out of memory here. And I was beginning my segue, and before we introduce today's author, I will continue that. What was taken in by Gibson and then rather progressed by great thinkers like Chimero and the aforementioned Wilson, whose article I read at the University in Leeds, was how actually one thing that is central to the tenets of Martin Heidegger, that is this really tough concepts of Vorhanden and Zuhanden. And the problem is not one or the other, the problem is putting them as one and the other. And Vorhanden is very close to information, or the law-like thing, and the dynamic relationship is more Zuhanden. They do not exactly overlap, but there is a mutual scale, I would say. And on the one scale we have, of course, Vorhanden, and this is hinting to this is where we usually want or try to get things to be in the Vorhanden. But as Heidegger says, Vorhanden is a very, very unusual way of being in the world. It does exist, but it's extremely unusual. And it is not unusual in our trying to get the world to be Vorhanden, which is a different thing. And by realizing that both are valid but of different natures, the problem resolves itself. And for me, that also meant a most marvelous understanding of these things, a deepening of the understanding. And I think it's legit here with a segue to Wittgenstein reads Heidegger and Heidegger reads Wittgenstein by Paul M. Livingston. I started with this one in 1319 and one lecture before, so I will continue and I will at the end make a recap and lead in for some questions. My dear colleague Kalle Lundahl here has offered to give an introduction to said author. So I will pass him the microphone here, as we just learned to do.
Paul Livingston, yes, he is at the Department of Philosophy at the University of New Mexico, in the state of New Mexico in the United States. And he says that I, Paul Livingston, work on the philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, phenomenology, metaphysics, political philosophy, from a perspective grounded in the history of 20th century philosophy, analytic and continental. In 2020 he came out with a book or anthology, Idealism, Relativism and Realism, new essays on objectivity beyond the analytic continental divide.
That sounds rather interesting. Thank you very much, Kalle. I will put a link, as I did earlier. I've been starting to getting good with these things, so you can look for yourself. And I am currently at page 7, the last paragraph. In Being and Time, Heidegger's brief and elliptical discussion of language emphasizes its secondary derivative status as founded in discourse. And the fundamental ontological possibility of a transformation from one to the other. Thus, the existential ontological foundation of language is in discourse. Language is the way discourse gets expressed. Discourse is itself the articulation of intelligibility. And as such, an articulation is always separable into isolated significance or meanings, Bedeutungen. Nevertheless, the wordly character of discourse as an articulation of the intelligibility of the there means that it yields a totality of significations, Bedeutungsganze. Which can then be put into words or can come to word. Language can then be defined as a totality of words. In this totality, discourse has a worldly being of its own. It thus may be subsequently happen that language, the totality of words, becomes something in the world which we can come across as ready to hand, zu handen, or indeed break up analytically into objectively present world things which are present at hand. Language's specific way of manifesting being in the world, or of disclosing the worldly character of the beings that we ourselves are. Is to appear in the world as a totality of words ambiguously experienced as tools of use or objective word things. Discourse itself, Heidegger goes on to say, supports the ever-present possibilities of hearing or keeping silent. These possibilities as possibilities of discursive speech disclose for the first time the constitutive function of discourse for the existentiality of existence. But they are not in any direct way connected to the ontological structure of language itself, which must, Heidegger says, still be worked out. Whatever else it may be, the story of the existential significance of words in being and time is not, therefore, the document of an inherent human tendency to run up against the boundaries of language. That ultimately, even in being frustrated, can yield a transformative indication of the limits of the world as such. The worldly character of language is here not a matter of its actual or possible correlation to the totality of facts, or situations in the world, but rather of its tendency to appear within the world as an objectively present totality of signs or of word things. Abstracted and broken up with respect to the original sources of their meaning in the lived fluidity of discourse. This is not a subjective running up against the boundaries of language, but something more like falling of meaning into the world in the form of its capture by objective presence. There are, to be sure, distinctive dangers here. Heidegger will go on, in fact, to suggest that it is in this tendency to interpret language as an objectively present being that the traditional and still dominant conception of logos remains rooted. A conception that yields an insufficiently radical understanding of meaning and truth. One which the present more penetrating, existential analytic must deconstruct. But there is no suggestion that any part of this analysis involves recognizing the boundaries of language as such. Or considering how the tendency to speak beyond them issues in nonsense. Moreover, although the possibility of keeping silent does indeed bear, for Heidegger, a primary disclosive significance. What it tends to disclose is not the limits of the world beyond which it is impossible to speak, but rather quite to the contrary. The inherent positive structure of Dasein's capability to make the world articulate and intelligible. This is not the obligatory silence. Which concludes the Tractatus. Beyond the bounds of language, where nothing can be said, but rather the contingent silence that results from a reticence. Of which Dasein is always capable. And which is indeed at the root of Dasein's strictly correlative capability of having something to say. Heidegger's remarks on the nothing and anxiety in what is metaphysics were famously the basis for Carnap's dismissive rejection. In the 1932 article the overcoming of metaphysics through the logical analysis of language. Of Heidegger's whole project as metaphysical and as violating the very conditions for the meaningfulness of any possible language. Part of what motivated Carnap in his ire was, doubtless, Heidegger's visible contempt for the attempt to structure language logically. In the inaugural address, as we have seen, he describes the experience of the nothing as leading to a disintegration of logic. And the remarks on language in being and time are dedicated to a task of liberating grammar from logic. From the perspective of Carnap's logical empiricist project, which was dedicated to the elimination of dangerous and idle metaphysics by means of a clarification of the underlying logical structure of meaningful language as such. These suggestions could only seem to represent the most misleading kind of obscurantism. Yet, as recent scholarship has emphasized, it would be a mistake simply to identify Wittgenstein's conception of logical structure with that of Carnap. For whom Wittgenstein also had little sympathy. For whereas the point of identifying the bounds of language for Carnap is consideration of science and objectivity by means of the identification and elimination of the pseudo-sentences that lie beyond them. The point is for Wittgenstein just about directly the opposite. As Wittgenstein famously wrote later, the whole point of the Tractatus was ethical. Presumably in the sense that it was to bring us to a self-conscious experience of those limits beyond which we cannot speak. Here was not then the excessive beyond of meaninglessness. Grounded in the violation of fixed logical rules, but the very possibility of a mystical or aesthetic vision of the world. The vision subspecie aeterni of the world as a limited whole. Here I have to put in a comment. Remember the singular universe. A limited whole is very parallel. So although it would certainly be wrong to say that the problem of the limits of language stands or falls with a rigid deterministic conception of the structure of language. That cannot come imposed in his critical remarks on Heidegger. There is, it seems, between Wittgenstein and Heidegger a significantly broader and more general question of the relationship of language and world that remains open and probably remains with us even today. This can be put as the question: what does the very existence of language have to do with the nature of the world it seems to bound? And what does it mean that the structure of language, which seems to set the very boundaries of the possibilities for speaking of facts and objects, and hence determine what we can understand? As the world can again be thought and even experienced within the world, thus bounded. Without overstatement, it would be possible to say that this is the question that links 20th century linguistic philosophy. In its specificity to all that has formerly been thought under the heading of transcendence, and the transcendental. And though it is not obvious where solutions may lie, it seems that this question remains very much with us today. Heidegger's remark on Wittgenstein comes almost 40 years later in one of Heidegger's very last seminars. The last of 3 seminars the aging philosopher held in Le Tour, France. The seminar as a whole is ostensibly directed to the elucidatory discussion on Kant's pre-critical work. The sole possible proof for a demonstration of the existence of God. And more specifically, to its first chapter on existence as a whole. Though there is in fact little explicit discussion of Kant anywhere in the seminar. The mention of Wittgenstein, however, comes early in the course of the first seminar session on September the 2nd, 1969. So we pose the question, what does the question of being mean? For, as a question, the question of being already offers numerous possibilities for misunderstanding. Something confirmed by the continual failure to understand the book Being and Time. What does the question of being mean? If one says being from the outset, one understands the word metaphysically. That is, from out of metaphysics. However, in metaphysics and its tradition, being means that which determines a being insofar as it is a being. As a result, metaphysically, the question of being means the question concerning the being as being. Or otherwise put, the question concerning the ground of being. To this question, the history of metaphysics has given a series of answers. As an example, energia. Here, reference is made to the Aristotelian answer to the question. What is the being as being? An answer which runs energia, and not some hypokimenon. For its part, the hypokimenon is an interpretation of beings, and by no means an interpretation of being. In the most concrete terms, hypokimenon is the presencing of an island or of a mountain. And when one is in Greece, such a presencing leaps into view. Hypokimenon is in fact the being as it lets itself be seen. And this means that which is there before the eyes, as it brings itself forth from itself. Das, was da ist, vor den Augen, wie es da von sich selbst her sich hinzieht. Thus the mountain lies on the land and the island in the sea. Such is the Greek experience of beings. Being for us, being as a whole, taonda, is only an empty word. For us, there is no longer that experience of beings in the Greek sense. On the contrary, as in Wittgenstein, the real is what is the case. That which falls under determination lets itself be established, the determinable, actually an eerie gespantischer statement. For the Greeks, on the contrary, this experience of beings is so rich, so concrete, and touches the Greeks to such an extent that there are significant synonyms. Ta phenomenema, ta aletheia, for this reason, it gets us nowhere to translate taonda literally as the beings. In so doing, there is no understanding of what is being for the Greeks. It is authentically ta aletheia. What is revealed in unconcealment. What postpones concealment for a time. It is ta phenomena. What here shows itself from itself. That ends Heidegger and his quote. As he often does at this late stage in his career, Heidegger couches his remarks as a kind of retrospective of his own work. Giving a prominent place to the question of being, raised by being and time, while complaining, as he often did, of that book's failure ultimately to communicate the sense and significance of this question. In fact, though, as Heidegger clarifies, the relevant question of being here is not simply the one formulated in being and time, which concerns the meaning or sense of being. But rather by way of a decisive shift, the question of the ground of being. Of what it means to think the various bases that determine in each of the various conceptions or epochs that comprise the history of metaphysics. Beings as such and as a whole. The problem, as Heidegger explains elsewhere, is now one of thinking what variously determines the ways. Now in the plural. That beings as such and as a whole can be thought and experienced. And thinking this determining instance now, no longer itself in terms of beings, but only in terms of being itself. This is the question of the historical truth of being, or how being itself gives or grants itself in or as its event of ereignis by grounding in various and historically variable ways. The possibility of conceiving of and experiencing beings in their totality. From the initial Platonic understanding of beings as determined by the beingness of the idea, through the medieval conception of God as the summa ens, and the modern metaphysics of subjectivity, up to the contemporary regime of dominant technology. This question of grounding, according to Heidegger, receives a series of different answers in the metaphysical tradition. But all of these answers are ways of determining the character of beings as a whole by opening or projecting their sense. So Heidegger at his end was disappointed that being in time didn't succeed in transmitting and relaying being in the way that it was originally meant by the Greeks. And he's referring to the representationalist understanding of the earlier Wittgenstein in Tractatus. Is very close to the left hemisphere's way of understanding beings, distinct things separated from each other, the same as I previously in 1334 showed to be the idea of the observer very far away, just seeing the observed, the object, and making conclusions of it. This is, of course, the separation of Locke, where he projects some aspects like extension and mass to the outside world, and colors and smells to the inside world of the observer. This is being lost. This is beings. A secondary, randomly derived product. And I would say this reinforces Terry's marvelous exposure of how we really intermingle in a very deep and entangled way, observer and observed, and in that manner constructing both absolutely objective and the subjective. In affordances, we understand that so many properties are already out there. So the very idea that I, almost like for the first time, perceive this cup, and there, à la Locke, I make a perception. This does not hold true to what we know This is not quantum mechanics, where the constant entanglement is the absolute foundation both for objectivity and a personal view. And of course, this is a sort of death knell to the Newtonian paradigm or Lockean view of absolute separation. It shows to the impossibility of separation. And I will also say it shows in the speech of Heidegger that no tool did work for him to transmit the gospel, to make people aware of being. But I would say the tool of Terry, in concert with affordances as relational, already having all the information you need out there, as in the beer can. But you can also see the observer always already being out there in the form of a beer can with all its relations stretching far away, being as complicated as the human mind itself. It is nothing short of a proof of the existence of the observer. And this is the liberative way out of separatedness, because it shows we are isolating ourselves from knowledge, from understanding. We are lacking by sending the beer can to Vorhanden so far as it gets gespenstiger, an eerie perception of not being there. The perception of Steven Weinberger, even more so Daniel Dennett. This is the reason for the eerie, gespantischer brain in the vat. This is the reason why we try to get out our own bodies to some destination that just doesn't exist. It is like having a straitjacket on that hinders your intellectual moving senses to come into the world, to intermingle fractally as affordances, and to quench your thirst more for knowing. Because we are not only reductive flesh, we are knowing entities. We are part of being, but also disjunct from it. And one thing does not exclude the other. It's a dipole. It's a mutual necessity. Isn't that just great? Thanks, Terry. And thank you. Have a very pleasant afternoon. And as you can see, although not visible in the sky, there is an There is a spring approaching, and I would say it's a spring also for humans.